Hello and welcome back to the Pacific War channel, the channel where we cover the complete Asia-Pacific War from 1937 to 1945, and all the major events that led up to it. And today we're going to be doing probably the most complicated task, and that is trying to summarize the Meiji Restoration of Japan. You might be asking yourself, how does this have anything to do with the Pacific War? The Meiji Restoration directly led to a militarized Japan empire later on that we see in the 1940s, which would inevitably cause the Second World War. Now, two things before I begin. The first being, if you've not already seen the previous episode on the many attempts at opening up Japan, please click on the card above, as it gives a ton of context about, how we got to this point. Second, there is simply no way for me to summarize the Meiji Restoration in one episode. Please bear with me that the only way to describe such a feat is like summarizing the entire Renaissance into one episode. The Meiji Restoration encompassed an entire shift in all aspects of Tokugawa Japan into the modern era. For those unfamiliar with Tokugawa Japan, it's referring to the Edo Shogunate period of 1600 to 1868. I will be narrowing it down to some key aspects for the sake of coherency, and I hope you will forgive me if I didn't touch on subjects that you're interested in. I apologize. Also, just a few terms you should know before beginning. Shogunate was a hereditary military dictatorship of Japan led by the shogun, who happened to be the Tokugawa family during 1600 to 1868. The Bakufu was the military government headed also by the shogun. Daimyo is a regional samurai ruler who resides over a han, which we can also refer to as a domain. Now, how did we get here? Reminder, my previous episode spoke about this, but here's a loose summarization. Tokugawa Japan enforced an isolationist foreign policy known as Sakoku, closed country, for over 214 years. During this time, there was many attempts by foreign nations to open Japan up for trade, and this eventually occurred in 1853 when Commodore Matthew C Perry led an expedition to Japan, forcing them to open up and sign a treaty with the United States. Signature of this treaty would occur in 1858. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce, signed in 1858, outlined an exchange of diplomatic agents between the US and Japan, the opening of the following ports for foreign trade: Edo, Kobe, Nagasaki, Niigata, and Yokohama, to allow US citizens to live and trade within open ports, for foreign residents to abide by the laws of their own nations instead of Japanese law system, a fixed low import-export duty subject to international control but heavily favoring the US, and the right of religious freedom and church construction to serve the needs of the US nationals within the foreign settlements of treaty ports. Now, this treaty was quite unequal, as you can see. The treaty favored foreigners, particularly the United States, when it came to trade, and literally stamped on Japan's sovereignty. Why did Japan give in to all of this? A large reason was because of the Second Opium War. You see, the Japanese officials were being fed news of how horrible the situation was for China, and they knew they had little to no chance of fighting off the Western nations at this time. They did not possess the technological weapons, nor have the military structure to even compete with such nations as US or Britain. This treaty was followed up by a few other treaties which were just as unfair to Japan, such as the Anglo-Japanese Friendship Treaty and the Anglo-Japanese Amity and Commerce Treaty. Now, the Tokugawa shogun, Ieyasu, literally died after a few days when Matthew Perry's expedition came into Japan, and he was preceded by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who promptly died in 1858, most likely from a cholera outbreak. Needless to say, the Tokugawa rule and even their shoguns were crumbling, and some key figures would rise up as a result. The treaty and foreigner situation created two factions among the Shishi. This refers to men of high purpose. These are court officials, young samurai, daimyos, basically the most powerful people in the country. One faction sought to revere the emperor and expel the foreigner, Sonyo Joi. They looked to bolster the power of the emperor and saw the shogun as a threat. These people are usually referred to as Isshin Shishi, and I will be calling them that from now on. The shogunate supporting faction thought that the foreigners were too powerful to expel and that signing the treaty was in the best interest of the country. A powerful entity emerged amongst the shogunate supporters named Lee Nasuke, who became the Tairo, Great Elder, a position lesser to the shogun, but because of all the chaos, he was in fact controlling the Bakufu, more so than the shogun. Seeing this disastrous situation laid out between the two factions, Lee Nasuke did something a little bit rash. Lee Nasuke ordered a purge, known as the Ansei Purge, on behalf of the Bakufu faction, and it removed the power of the Isshin Shishi via imprisonment, torture, exile, and even execution. Over 100 people were victims to this purge, some losing their lives. Lee Nasuke assumed his actions would end the Isshin Shishi movement. As a result of this, in 1860, Lee Nasuke was assassinated on his way to the Edo castle by Isshin Shishi, and this became known as the Sakura Damon incident. The assassination was followed up by a Choshu domain, today Yamaguchi Prefecture, who were Isshin Shishi, seizing control over the imperial court within Kyoto. Domains seeking to ally themselves to the shogun faction, such as the Anzu and Satsuma domains, today's Fukushima and Kagoshima Prefecture, immediately expelled the Choshu samurai in 1863, which led the Choshu to send an entire army to try and enter the imperial palace in Kyoto. However, again, the Anzu and Satsuma forces repelled them. So to complicate this story further, the Satsuma and Choshu domains experienced some foreign military might in minor conflicts with Britain, and realized that expelling the foreigners was pretty much impossible. This led the former rivals of Satsuma and Choshu domain to make a secret alliance in 1866. Then, the Satsuma domain refused to participate in a Bakufu expedition against Choshu domain, and was secretly arming the Choshu with a large quantity of arms. During all of this, the current shogun Tokugawa Ieyamochi dies, and he's succeeded by a rather reluctant Tokugawa Yoshinobu. Yoshinobu came to power at a terrible time. Satsuma domain, Choshu domain, and Toso domain formed an alliance seeking to abolish the shogunate system and give power back to the emperor. Advisors to Yoshinobu pushed him to resign as shogun and take up a lesser role in the new governance system. He tendered his resignation on November the 9th, 1867, to the emperor Taisei Hokan. With the dissolution of the shogun role, this also meant that the court was proclaiming the restoration of imperial rule of old, Osei Fuko no Daigore, meaning the emperor was the one in power, but not really. You see, Yoshinobu dissolved the shogun position and created a council which was chaired by him. This new system was called Kobu Gaita, and basically he was shogun without being called shogun. This meant Tokugawan influence on all aspects of the new government. The Satsuma Choshu Tosa coalition were outraged and decided to take control by force, and this led to what is known as the Boshin War, and we'll be referring to this as the Restoration War as well. I know this is going to kill you, but I am going to gloss over the Boshin War, as I will be doing an entire episode solely upon it later. What you need to know is that it was a civil war between those backing the old shogun against those backing the imperial court. In all honesty, though, it was just a vacuum power grab situation, and everyone just chose a side. Even Western nations played a minor role in this. The imperial court faction won, and the Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa domains, having played a key role in the victory, gained key positions in the new government for several decades. The current emperor, Komei, dies on February the 3rd, 1867, and Emperor Meiji takes the throne. On September the 19th, the name of the city of Edo was changed to Tokyo, meaning Eastern Capital. This new era would be called the Meiji, or Enlightened Rule, after, of course, the emperor's name. On April the 7th, 1868, the emperor was presented with a charter oath, and the charter oath consisted of 5 points. Deliberate councils shall be widely established in all matters decided by public discussion. All classes, high and low, shall unite in vigorously carrying out the administration of affairs of state. The common people, no less than the civil and military officials, shall each be allowed to pursue his own calling so that there may be no discontent. Evil customs of the past shall be broken off, and everything based upon the just laws of nature. And knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. The Charter Oath was the first major reform that would change the Tokugawa Shogunate system into a new Meiji Era. The Meiji Restoration was done specifically to thwart the very real threat of Japan becoming colonized, occupied, and exploited economically by Western nations. The idea was, in order to not be bullied, Japan would simply become a modern world power, like the nations posing threats to it. Now, like I said, at the beginning of this episode, I can't cover the Meiji Restoration A to Z. I want to focus on a few key aspects that make up the Meiji Restoration, which also happen to be the official motto of the new Meiji government. They were Bunmai Keika, civilization and enlightenment, and Fukuko Koye, enrich the country and strengthen the army. Basically, this is, civilization, enlightenment, and governance, military, and economics. These are the main points I want to talk about. There's a ton others, but I simply can't go into them. So, first, centralization and the new political government, Bunmei Keika. So, during the Tokugawa-led Edo period, Japan was under a Bakufu-Han system of governments. So before I start, I'm just going to put an overlay of useful terms in a diagram because this is going to get very confusing for the audience who are not knowledgeable in such things. So looking at the diagram, you can see it is a feudal class society with two large orders, the Bakufu central political government and the Shogun military structure. The ruling class are samurai, military men permitted to carry a sword, followed by farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. The Bakufu central government in Edo had absolute political power over the Han's local government domains. The shogun gave daimyos land to rule. In return, the daimyo pledged loyalty to the shogun. Despite how centralized this looks, economically it was a mess. Each Han was able to decide its own tax rates and other economic regulations without much Bakufu say. The only real thing keeping it all together was the Saikin Kotai system. The system was a requirement of all daimyo to alternate their residence from their respective Han and in the court at Edo. Basically, this meant they would leave their families as hostages each time they were alternating. It was a feudal hostage system, something that's actually seen in some European societies at this time. So after the Charter Oath was promulgated, a general outline for Japan's development and modernization was set. This was to be a mixture of Western concepts and the revival of ancient Japanese structures of bureaucracy, fuko, a return to antiquity. In order to create the massive cultural change they sought, the new Meiji government sought to learn as much as they could from the most developed nations of their time. The famous Iwakura mission of 1871 to 1873 was a diplomatic voyage to the West made by Japan's government high officials, accompanied by many students and highborn tourists as they could muster. The aim of the mission was to gain recognition for the newly reinstated imperial dynasty under Emperor Meiji, to change the unequal treaties that had been signed with Western nations, and to explore all aspects of these Western nations, whether it be political, military, education, or economics. So after the Boshin War was concluded, the daimyo of Satsuma, Choshu, Hizen, and Tosa surrendered their armies and domains to the emperor. Other daimyo quickly followed. Well, they were forced to, as all the daimyo were reappointed as governors to their respective domains, which were now subdivisions to the new central government. Han domains were abolished and instead made into prefectures, which would be controlled by bureaucrats appointed from the new central government. The former daimyos got generous retirement packages, and most became local administrators working for this new central government. By 1871, Japan was a fully centralized state, something the Tokugawa Shogunate never managed to really be. The central government allowed the creation of consultative local assemblies, which provided the common Japanese opportunities to participate in politics, but most importantly, not to have the ability to challenge the authority of the central government. Japan never had a written constitution, and the new centralized government sought one, but were very wary of full-blown democracy or republics. They were instead favoring something between monarchy and democracy. Japan sent ambassadors to many Western nations looking for models to build upon. The United States Constitution was rejected because it was far too liberal. France and Spain's models were rejected because they seemed far too draconian and absolute. Britain's Westminster system seemed to be too unwieldy and granted too much power to Parliament for their liking. The Reichstag and legal structures of the German Empire, more specifically that of Prussia, proved to be the most interesting model for Japan's new constitution. Thus, a cabinet was formed in 1885 headed by Ito Hirobumi as the first prime minister of Japan. Many foreign advisors, particularly German ones, came to aid Japan in building its model. Japan wanted to balance sovereign power of the emperor with an elected legislature that could limit such powers when needed. What came about was the Meiji Constitution of 1889. It came into effect in 1890, and now I'll put up this very simple and easy to understand diagram. Take a nice gander at it. The organizational structure was heavily influenced by Prussian and British structures, notably the House of Representatives. Clear limits of power were established on the executive branch, as well as the emperor. Civil rights and liberties were guaranteed. What made it uniquely Japanese was that sovereignty resided with the emperor rather than the people. The emperor had the right to exercise an executive authority to appoint and dismiss all government officials. For those of you who know your World War II Japanese politics, we all know where this is going. The emperor had the sole right to declare war, make peace, conclude treaties, dissolve diets, and he held command over the army and the navy. There was a privy council to the emperor and the inner circle of advisors known as the general, who would wield considerable influence. Now, I won't go any more into this, but note, this entire system is arguably what caused Japan's fall into a military society, and a lot of these officials that came about are what caused the Asia-Pacific War of 1937. So let's move on to education and religion, still talking about Bumai Geika. A new educational system was created, influenced heavily by America, Prussia, and Germany. There was 3 types of schooling: elementary, middle, and university. Elementary education was made universal for 4 years of schooling and was mandatory each school year, consisting of 4 months. This, of course, would be expanded upon gradually later. In 1872, there was a 28% attendance rate for those of school age. By 1878, this went up to 40%, mostly made up of boys. The Meiji leaders dictated that there shall be no community with an unschooled family and no family with an unschooled person. Eventually, a centralized school system was formed, preparing people for the new economic political roles in the new industrialized society. The nation-state played a very important role in education and sought to mobilize the people of Japan towards service of the nation. Thus, the government assumed an educative role, instructing the people in the values and habits of a newly conceived national identity. The creation of the new educational system had become the nation's kyumu, urgent business. Japan gained 8 university districts, 32 middle school districts, and 210 elementary school districts during the Meiji Era. By 1912, 98% of children in Japan were being educated, and this is an incredible feat. There was, however, a dissatisfaction with the direction of this education at the very beginning. You see, the new Meiji state sought fuko, to restore antiquity, but at the same time to acquire the tools of the contemporary and modern world. When we say restore antiquity, this was seen as freeing the Japanese culture from its encumbrances of Chinese and Buddhist Confucian importations. This was a push to emphasize the old native deities and mythology of Japan before the Chinese influences, thus Shinto. There was a large emphasis on showcasing that Japan had a traditional history of adopting and borrowing from other cultures, such as China. This was because the new Meiji government wanted to show to its people it was okay to adopt new aspects from other cultures, which would be required to become a modern nation themselves. This is also shown quite well by the famous debate between Japan's intellectual Mori Aranori and the Chinese leader Li Hongzhang in 1876. During a meeting, Li looked at Mori's Western-styled suit and asked him if his Japanese ancestors had dressed the way he did. Mori replied, no, they did not. In fact, they had adopted Chinese dress, but that was no longer of practical use. Mori said that Japan had always taken the best of other civilizations for itself, and it was doing so once more. Mori then reminded Li that Li's ancestors had not worn the official robes prescribed by China's Manchu conquerors either. Japan, by interference, was at least making its own decision. You see, he's basically insulting Chinese culture at this point. It's a funny jest. Anyways, all of this meant overhauling the Buddhist and Confucian influence that had reigned over Japan for many ages. The new Meiji government quickly relegated Confucianism to a secular philosophy, no longer part of the official state theology. In 1870, school textbooks based on Confucian ethics were replaced with westernized texts. In 1890, the imperial rescript on education was signed by Emperor Meiji, and this articulated the government policy on the guiding principles of education on the new Meiji Emperor of Japan. It emphasized the common goals of rapid modernization, which meant westernization, with the support of the imperial institution. There was a pushback and a call for reviving the principles of Confucianism as a guide of education and public morality. However, the proponents of the modernization of Japan felt this would encourage a fall back into feudalism. The rescript, in many ways, was a compromise. It pushed traditional ideals of Confucianism with the new national interest highlighted by the Constitution. Despite the Religious Freedom Declaration, there was a campaign against Buddhism in order to promote Shinto and more specifically to separate Shinto from Buddhism, which were intertwined during the Tokugawa years. A synthetic great teaching was created to produce patriotic and ideologically malleable subjects. It was ostensibly non-sectarian and national with a Shinto-centered focus. There were three main instructions. Revere the gods, kami, and love the country, clarify heavenly reason and the way of humanity, and revere the emperor and respect the court. Preaching guides focused on paying taxes, complying with rescripts, education, a solar calendar, military buildup, fukuko kiyome, and importation of Western learning and modern civilization. Japan's rapid industrialization and economy, fukuko kiyome, enriched the country and strengthened the army. Now, I previously mentioned that many Japanese went out to Western nations to look for models to base their culture changes upon. In the early years, Meiji Japan was an agrarian society where 70% of the population was involved in farming, forestry, and fishing, and this accounted for 60% of the national output. Japan's Industrial Revolution began in textiles, particularly with silk, but also with cotton. During the early Meiji Era, nearly half of Japan's imports came from Britain in the form of cotton and woolen goods. By 1890, Japan's textile work began to dominate its home market and overthrew the British, Chinese, and Indian textile work that had strangled them. Japan began to ship its textile products overseas, particularly to other Asian nations, and the unequal import-export situation began to fix itself. Japan used steam-powered mills to produce their goods, which meant they needed coal. The demand for coal led the Meiji government to build factories, shipyards, chemical industries, mining, railroads, and, ominously, many munition factories. The Meiji government first set up model factories in most industries, but soon embraced the capitalist system of Britain and America. The private sector exploded with aggressive entrepreneurs and financial business conglomerates, known as the zaibatsu, guiding the nation alongside the government, all borrowing technology and ideas from the West. The Industrial Revolution of Meiji Era Japan was a policy of catching up to the modern world and a joint effort between the central government and private business. Here are some numbers to give an idea of how monumental this all was. The Japanese population working in agricultural shrank from 75% in 1872 to 50% by 1920. The population rose from 34 million in 1872 to 52 million by 1915. Raw silk production and export went from 646 tons in 1872 to 9,462 tons by 1915. Coal production went from 0.6 tons in 1875 to 21.3 tons by 1913. The merchant fleet size of 26 ships in 1873 became 1,514 ships by 1913, and the length of the train track from starting about 29 kilometers in 1872 went to a whopping 11,400 kilometers by 1914. Now, before you look fondly at all of this, do remember that the Japanese laborers suffered immensely during the rapid industrialization process, just as laborers in Europe and America had during their own industrial revolution. Japanese miners lived in barracks and worked 12-hour shifts for very little pay and in the presence of guards who made sure they did not slack off. The agricultural sector of Japan's economy was bearing the brunt of the taxes to pay for the cost of modernizing and industrializing the nation. 1/3 of Japan's arable land was farmed by tenants, and the average tenant paid about 60% of his crop to the landowners as rent, half of which went to the government as a land tax, and 40% of farmers who owned their land had only 1.1 acres or less. On top of all this, the peasants were very unhappy and being drafted into the military. This became known as a blood tax. In order to create a sense of identity with the national interest, the Meiji government needed to drum up its people with a sense of loyalty and service to the emperor. And now we've come to the military. Fukuko Kyoe. The modernization of the Japanese military during the Meiji period should come to no surprise. It was a direct response to the growing threat of Western colonial powers. Similar to other aspects we discussed, they looked at military models from Western powers. Small arms and artillery had been imported into Japan from Europe during the mid-16th century and were used extensively in Japan's civil wars. The Sakoku period had dampened the trade network, however, the arms developed and lagged during the Tokugawa years as a result. In 1868, the Meiji government established the Tokyo Arsenal, where small arms and ammunition would be manufactured. The first military academy was established in 1868 by Masujiro Umura in Kyoto. Umura is regarded as the father of the modern Japanese army. He sought to introduce conscription and military training for commoners rather than relying on the hereditary feudal force Tokugawa Japan had relied upon. Many conservative samurai opposed this, obviously, because it would end their only source of livelihood and their position within Japanese society. Sadly, Umura was assassinated in 1869 by a group of these samurai. When Emperor Meiji assumed power of the state, he ordered the formation of an imperial guard to protect himself and the imperial family. The imperial guard was organized and trained along French military lines, consisting of 12,000 officers. In 1873, the conscription laws were passed requiring every able-bodied male Japanese citizen, regardless of social class, to serve a mandatory 3 years of military service. This effectively ended the samurai class and caused a social unrest which eventually saw a large conflict known as the Satsuma Rebellion, also referred to as the Sianen War. Again, like the Boshin War, I will be covering this in another episode, and it'll be very awesome. I just simply can't speak about it here. I am very sorry to the audience, but we can't go into this. Now, in conjunction with the new law, the government modeled their ground forces after the French military and used these same rank structures. The French government contributed to this by helping train the Japanese officers. Before the Meiji government came to be, it was actually the shogunate who in 1867 asked France for help. The French sent 18 personnel to train 11,000 infantry of the shogunate. However, as time went on, and particularly after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, the Meiji military began to be more influenced by the Prussian model. By 1878, Yamagata Aritomo pushed for the military to adopt the German military system. Gradually, the military switched from the French to German system, and one of the important changes was the adoption of the division of the army into 2 chains of command, administrative and operational. In 1872, the military was divided into the Army Ministry and Navy Ministry. Japan built its first steam warship in 1863 called the Chiyoda-gata, which was a 140-ton gunboat. In 1870, an imperial decree determined that the British Navy should be the model for development, and a second British naval mission to Japan, which is known as the Douglas Mission of 1873 to 1879, was led by Archibald Lucius Douglas. The mission laid the foundations of naval officer training and education. France also played a part during the 1880s. They influenced a doctrine favoring small, fast warships such as cruisers and torpedo boats against bigger units. As a result, the Meiji government began building 48 warships, 22 of which were torpedo boats in 1882. In 1882, there was a imperial rescript calling for an unquestioned loyalty to the emperor by the new armed forces. It also asserted the commands of superior officers to be equivalent to the command of the emperor himself. This meant top-ranking military leaders were given direct access to the emperor and authority to transmit his pronouncements directly to the troops. As you can imagine, this eventually would blur lines between political leadership and military. The military remained untested in the early years, so in 1874 Japan launched a military expedition on Taiwan to assert their claims to the Ryukyu Islands. You see, a Ryukyuan ship had shipwrecked on Taiwan in 1871 and the crew were massacred, giving Japan a pretext for their expedition. Please note that this expedition is known as the Mudan Incident to the Chinese. Japan did seek diplomacy with the Qing dynasty before invading, but the Qing court rejected their demands for compensation for the dead crew mates on the grounds that the Taiwanese were raw and wild natives who performed the massacre. Although the Japanese forces successfully invaded Taiwan and got the Qing government to pay an indemnity fee of 500,000 Kuping taels of silver, it should be noted that it was a colossal mess. More Japanese soldiers died of malaria, over 550 by estimates, than they killed of the Taiwanese tribal forces, casualties around probably 89. Regardless, Japan did occupy Taiwan and take one of its first military jabs at China. Then, in 1877, there was the Satsuma Rebellion, which I had already mentioned previously, and I will cover that in another episode. What you need to know is that the Conscription Act allowed Japan to gather more forces than the ex-samurai-led rebels, and they quickly overwhelmed them. To conclude, you've probably noticed that I am not talking much about anything after 1890. While the Meiji Restoration lasted until 1912, I do not want to talk about the greater development after 1890 just yet. This is because I will be covering large events such as the Boxer Rebellion, the First Sino-Japanese War, and the Russo-Japanese War very thoroughly in episodes later on. So I want to leave that till later on, as you would imagine. So, like all of my other episodes, let's try to summarize everything I just said. Japan underwent one of the most incredible rapid societal changes in human history when it went from Tokugawa-run shogunate Japan into the Meiji Era. All aspects of Japanese society changed, and it was a dichotomy between a return to antiquity, Fuko, and to modernize using the very best aspects Japan could find from other developed nations. This shift was messy, and quite a few rebellions occurred, such as the Boshin War and the Satsuma Rebellion. The modernization process gradually took on a militaristic theme, which after the Meiji era was absolutely dominant over all aspects of Japan, and the Japanese Empire as we see it in World War II eventually came to be. I really hope you liked this brutal summarization of the Meiji Restoration, and I know I probably didn't cover a lot of aspects that you would like. Maybe you wanted a more militaristic look at it, maybe you were interested in the economics. I tried to find somewhere on the grounds of touching the most important aspects, and of course I didn't touch the two largest wars that happened, the Boshin War and the Satsuma Rebellion. But like I said, the reason I did this was because I want to dedicate full episodes to them, and they will be coming up rather soon, so stay tuned for that, because it's going to get good. And for you Westerners, I am going to talk about The Last Samurai. It does have some story involved in the Satsuma Rebellion and the Boshin War a little bit, and it'll be an interesting, eye-opening experience for those who didn't realize that that ridiculous movie is based loosely, and I say loosely, off some stuff historically. This has been the Pacific War Channel, and can I get my bird to say something? Failure. Over and out.